And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Barton with Agribotix as our first presenter. Jason is Vice President of Sales with Agribotix, located in Boulder, Colorado, and has led sales teams for several agriculture and clean tech companies during his career. He has worked in agriculture in the United States, Canada, and Brazil, and has a PhD in agricultural science and economics. He brings this strong background to the evolving area of unmanned aircraft systems for agriculture and spends his spare time running Yard Harvest, a Colorado nonprofit that harvests fresh produce and delivers it to charities that serve people in need. So without further ado, I'll hand the program over to Jason.
Thanks, Wayne. Thank you all for your time and giving me the opportunity to be here. So, as Dr. Wold said, I'm with Agribotix, a company out of Colorado, and wanted to share with you some of what we're doing to help growers increase their yields and lower their costs through our drones and data processing. We'll give you an overview of our company, a little bit of where we came from and where we are now. FarmLens is our data processing and analytics platform. It's the core of our company. The Enduro Quad is one of our drones. It's our more popular model, though we do have a couple others. I'll look at some of our current and future developments on the software side, because that really is the focus of what we do, is on the software and the data processing. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, happy to follow up via email as you all see fit. So Agribotix actually began as a data processing company. As I said, that's the core of what we do. It's what delivers the value to growers. The drone is literally and figuratively a vehicle to get to that information. And so we began with stitching images together to create a map of a complete field. And then from a near infrared camera, we can do a false color contrast, which is what's called the NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. That shows where there's greater vegetation density and where there's less, which is basically crop health. And then from that baseline product, we developed shape files, and now we've developed a stand count product and others that kind of come out of our FarmLens data processing platform. From that software start, we identified a need to offer the complete solution. It's typical in technology that if potential customers are left to deal with several different vendors, they'll probably just not adopt the technology at all. And so when one company can give them everything they need, makes it more convenient and easier to adopt. And so that's what we started doing with our drones. We developed two. The Enduro Quad, as I mentioned, is a Copter vertical takeoff and landing. The range isn't quite as long as a fixed wing, but it is a little bit easier to use. The trade-off, the fixed wing that we have, which is called the Hornet, it covers a lot more, up to 400 acres in a single survey, versus a quadcopter, which can only cover about 160, or about a quarter section. And that's a typical trade-off between those two kinds of drones. So the value that we're finding growers are looking for over other technologies in precision ag is that our results are immediate, they're intuitive, and they're highly detailed. So soil data is essential for good precision agriculture, but it's not necessarily immediate. It takes a while to process. It's not necessarily as intuitive. It can be a little bit more difficult to interpret. Satellite data, on the other hand, can be really intuitive, but maybe not quite as immediate if a satellite only goes overhead every couple of weeks. And it's not as high resolution, so it's not as highly detailed for things like weed identification or weed detection or the stand count product I mentioned. And so really, we're looking to work in concert, complementing these other technologies, as we do deliver results that you can fly in the morning and you can be walking out in the field with a report on your smartphone that afternoon or the next day at the latest. These kinds of results can pull growers into more data-driven precision agriculture. If they're finding an advantage by using the data, they might then go back and say, okay, what other products does my co-op or seed and fertilizer dealer or John Deere dealer have that are going to help me, again, increase yields and lower costs. We also continue innovating more and more in the software side, and that way somebody who bought a drone from us a year ago is still adding more and more value, and that's very attractive. We all know that feeling of, if I just wait a little bit longer, the innovations that are in my cell phone or whatever else are going to be worth the wait. But by continuing to innovate on the software side, they can buy the hardware today and continue to add value down the line. So a case study coming out of 2014 is over a field of corn in Missouri. Our deliverables, the field health report is what we call an NDVI, and as I mentioned, it's viewable on a tablet or a smartphone. We also deliver a localized field level weather report that goes along with our field health report, and then variable application report is a shapefile that's very important for prescriptions for variable rate application. This is FarmLens, where our customers will upload their data and then go to retrieve the finished products like this. This is an example of NDVI, and a drone can fly over. This is probably a pretty small field, about 100, maybe 120 acres. A drone can fly this in about 20 minutes. In this case, it took 254 pictures that were uploaded. We stitched them together and then created the contrast. Here in the darker green area is where there's more vegetation density, and then it's just light green, yellow, orange, red, and gray are the lowest vegetation density, and so those are problem areas that we want to inspect. And that inspection is always important. We call it ground truthing. I'm sorry, I forgot I wanted to go through how we plan a mission like this. And so if you were going to fly this survey pattern in this 20-minute flight, you would want to cover the entire field. And the way you do it is through a software program. We use an off-the-shelf open source software program called Mission Planner. And so you would locate your field in what looks sort of like a Google Earth type image. And you would just make these 5 clicks around the boundary of the field. You would tell a little bit of information, such as the altitude you want to fly at. Maybe the wind direction is helpful if it's consistent and blowing pretty strong. And then the software will stitch a lawnmower pattern back and forth across this field to make sure that it gets good coverage and that every inch of the field is covered in several images so that we can stitch them together for a nice, clean final product. And this is what will deliver the value to the customer. As I started to say, it's always important once you make this flight and get the results to ground truth. This is our founder, Tom. He's standing out in a dark green area where the corn is up over his waist. This is back to that Missouri example I began with. In a gray area, as you can see, it's about his ankle, not quite knee high. And then in the middle is a yellow area where we can see it's knee to thigh high. So there is plenty of variability. And what's important about ground truthing is we might find that gray area is infested with some kind of pest that we can eliminate. Maybe we find that it is a low spot that needs to be filled in before next season. All sorts of things can be going on out there, so we need to get our eyes on it, possibly take a soil sample or a tissue sample, depending on what we find when we walk out there. We can then take that NDVI, or what we call the field health report, and turn it into a shapefile. And so to give an example of what might be an area that we want to address, this red area, we might find, if we look at this with our agronomist, that this is an area that's just not going to perform no matter what we do, and so we'll put less chemical, less fertilizer down in this area and save some money, and maybe do something in the off season. We might find again that that's a pest, and so we'll put down more herbicide there so that we can get a better yield at the end of the year. But this shapefile for that variable rate application is both economically and environmentally advantageous for all sorts of reasons. Some other benefits from drones and aerial imagery. Hail damage is very typical across ag country, and so here we can see that this grower knew that he'd gotten hit with hail but didn't know the extent. Once we have the bird's eye view, we can get a much better understanding what portion of the field maybe the acreage or the actual proportion has been affected, and that will help us with application decisions, marketing decisions, all sorts of pieces that'll help increase profits. Another example would be checking irrigation equipment for parching or flooding. This is a field here in Colorado. The grower had switched from groundwater to ditch water at the beginning of the season, and the increased sediment had clogged up several of his nozzles on his center pivot. You can see this gray area here was actually dead by the time he flew this in late August because it had been so parched. Another example would be from flooding. So this grower knew from this area here that there was a busted stopper on her field and the flood irrigation system had malfunctioned, but again didn't know the extent of the damage. And she told us that she would often walk along the inside of the field here along this fallow area. And of course, anybody who's spent time in ag country knows that standing there and looking to the left across that field, it would probably look very uniform. And then we would miss the flooded areas here and here. And so the bird's eye view is very helpful. This side on the right is actually a different crop. And so that's why it looks like relative poor health, but it's actually just less vegetation density because of the crop type. And again, we see a bare spot that would have escaped our attention if we'd have walked just along that fallow area. Fertilizer or seed tests are another great example. And hopefully you can see this line that goes right up the middle of the field. And there were two different fertilizer products that were used on that field. And so it looks like here there was a row skipped by a planter. Other than that, the rest of the left side of the field looks pretty good. But we can see that this right side of the field, whatever product was put there, performed better. And so that's very helpful for doing A/B comparisons of different products. This comes from the quadcopter that I mentioned, the Enduro. It surveys up to 160 acres in a single flight. And if you look at the camera bay underneath, you'll see that we can carry two cameras at the same time. And so that would usually be a near infrared camera and a standard visual camera as the two most common types. And as part of that complete solution, the convenience of offering everything in one spot, this case is wheeled and comes with a telescoping handle like a rollerboard suitcase that you take through the airport. The laptop computer is preloaded with that mission planner software that I showed you. The blue box here is a battery charger that works on your vehicle. It charges up two of these batteries at once, so that if you're going out in the field to fly for a day, you can go all day long without having to stop and recharge your batteries. The drones that we sell come preloaded with a year of our data processing software because, again, that's the core of the company. But about 40% of the data we process come from drones other than our own. So we are happy to work with people who have other kinds of drones. We try to make ourselves as universal as possible. I mentioned the corn stand count. That's number one because growers have told us that this will really be a game changer for them and deliver a lot of value. Anybody who's been familiar with row crop agriculture, a stand count for 100 years or more has been paper, pencil, and boots walking through a field and counting sections. Through a drone and through the data processing technologies, we can fly each one a much larger field and get a whole lot of samples. Each one of these dots is actually where the drone was when the picture was taken, and so the field of view for each image is much larger. So we do have this entire field covered in that single flight, and so the results take two forms. We get a heat map like this that shows us where the emergence, like in this red area, is poorer, and where the emergence in this green area is much better. And so that's very helpful. And then we also include a table of results so that we can get a count of plants, and that will also help with application decisions, marketing decisions, going back to my seed dealer to ask why it didn't go as well as he or she told me it would. Or in really extreme cases, I might want to take the planter back out into the field and try again if I am not getting good enough emergence. Another product that we're working on is for weed detection and identification. We can do this manually now, and so this is a great example of it. These areas inside the blue squiggles, the grower found, I believe this is back in Pennsylvania, a weed called burr cucumber, which sits up on top of the canopy of the crop. And so from inspecting along the edge, the grower knew there was a problem, flew the drone to get a better idea, went back out and ground truthed it and said, yes, indeed, these dark green areas are not really healthy crop. It's actually weeds. And so got on the phone with one of our engineers to draw those blue lines, and those blue lines aren't just to make a pretty picture. Once we put those together, we can actually quantify and say what proportion or what acreage within those blue lines is affected by that pest. And then that helps make decisions not based on hunches, but on data. Do I need to bring in a crop duster? Is there some other mechanical or chemical way that I can treat this pest to make sure that I eradicate it as cost effectively as possible? The trick will be in automating that process so that the software does it for us and can actually differentiate between not only the crop, which we've de-highlighted out here, but then showing this is one kind of weed, maybe an amaranth here, and then this is an annual weed that's different, and I'm going to treat it with a different kind of chemical. That's through a process called machine vision learning that will teach the software to differentiate between different leaf signatures so that we get a better and better idea what's happening in our field. The last development I'll share with you is on thermal imaging. This one is a little further out. Corn stand count will be ready in the next couple of months. That weed detection and identification products we're hoping for in maybe the next 6 months, so middle of growing season. Thermal imaging, at least for the application I'll show you, is probably going to be late 2016. These are storage piles of sugar beets, and what happens because of the high sugar content is they start to ferment. They heat up, and once they start heating up, that process spreads very rapidly. And these companies that store and market this crop can lose literally millions of dollars every season because of this process. So if we can locate those areas of fermentation in these storage piles, as you can see in these hot spots here and here, especially in much more widespread areas like along this row, if they can locate that sooner rather than later, they'll start taking that area out of storage and sending it to market sooner rather than later. And as we develop this thermal technology, we're looking at other applications like drought stress, livestock locating, livestock monitoring the health of cows in a feedlot or even out while grazing. These are some technologies that will really be helping, we think, in the next couple of years. A lot of our experience is global, and that's really helpful whether we're talking about Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere to keep us busy all year, or just the really different environments. What's happening in a densely populated area like Europe is very different than what's happening in the Midwest United States or areas of Australia that are really sparsely populated. And flying in those different places over 40 different crop types helps us help our growers that much better through that experience. And with that, I think we're ready for questions, or if there are no questions now, I'd be happy to answer some later via email.
Okay, yes, Jason, thank you very much for that informative and interesting presentation. Let's go ahead. Anybody might have questions, feel free to send them in the chat box there, and we'll answer them as we can. And then, as Jason mentioned, even at towards the end of this program, we'll have more opportunity. But let's go ahead and keep moving here. I do want to comment that.
Thank you, Dr. Walt.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. It looks as though Agribotix is right in the middle of the unmanned aircraft systems in agriculture development and evolution. A very interesting presentation and really interesting applications. You know, it's just amazing the possibilities that this technology holds for agriculture. The sugar beets, for example, and the thermal imaging there is just you know, something that I know I'd never thought of, and yet when you describe it, it makes perfect sense that it would potentially be great benefit. So again, thank you, Jason. That was great. And there may be some questions that crop up here as we go through the program. So if you're able to stay with us, that'd be fantastic. Well, let's keep moving forward here.